Welcome. Welcome to the Connecticut Psychological Association Social Justice Speaker Series Seminar. My name is Shiva. I'm the co-chair of this committee. I'm joined by my co-chair Janan and the other members of our planning committee, and Mena and Nida. At this time, I would like to say thank you to our sponsors. With their financial support, we are able to sustain this seminar series. So as you see in this slide, we have the name of our sponsors. But before everything, I would like to say thank you to the Connecticut Health Foundation for their support. They really supported us to improve the program. And also, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Ann Klee for all the hard work to make it possible for Social Justice Committee. And thank you so much. Now, we are going to go through our sponsors. As you see, we have sponsors at different levels. At platinum level, we have a comprehensive neuropsychological services, and I'm so proud to say that I'm affiliated with. Also, we have a Hartford Healthcare. Thank you so much. You also see your beautiful names at the level of supporters and friends. We acknowledge you all. And I would like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Brown. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I'm going to turn it over to Janan to share with you some information about Social Justice Speaker Series.
Thank you, Shiva. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Janan Wyatt, and I serve as the co-chair for this committee as a part of CPA. And on behalf of our entire planning committee, we are just thrilled that you could join us this evening. And we hope that you continue to enjoy and attend our future seminar sessions. Just to give a little background in history, the Social Justice Seminar Series was created in fall of last year as a CPA initiative to further our commitment to social justice and really promoting social justice in the field of psychology. We are currently celebrating, very excitingly, our 1-year mark in the seminar series. So a special shout out to, again, our donors, the amazing planning committee that I serve with, and for all of our speakers who presented last year. If you're in the audience, thank you for making our first year a success. In this next year, the CPA Social Justice Series, is committed to combating racism and promoting community healing and social justice. And most importantly, we're really committed to being advocates for change, both in our Connecticut community as well as communities across the country. We seek to offer free monthly seminar series to all CPA members, as well as to the broader Connecticut community and folks who are outside of Connecticut who just want to learn more and are committed to social justice issues. We are excited to announce that starting this year, for our March seminar, we'll be offering CE credits for psychologists. For selected seminars, there will be a small fee attached to that if you are not a CPA member, but we're very excited to introduce this new mechanism for our series. And also we'll be having a variety of speakers this year coming to talk with us about racism, discrimination, the importance of engaging in courageous conversations about social justice. And as we continue to grow and build our community, we ask that you join our listserv so you can continue to learn more about our seminars. At this moment, I'm going to hand it over to Netta to introduce our speaker for this evening. Again, thank you so much for attending. We're so excited to create and join this space with you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again. So at this time, we're going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Tasha Brown is a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of New York. Dr. Brown specializes in providing clinical care to children, adolescents, and young adults. Specifically, she focuses on providing parent management training, cognitive behavioral therapy, and is a certified trainer in parent-child interaction therapy. Dr. Brown is the owner of a Tasha M. Brown Psychological Services and the host of the podcast Notes from a child psychologist. In addition, Dr. Brown is a clinician in the school-based program and assistant professor of medical psychology at New York Columbia University Irving Medical Center. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Brown believes it is part of her duty as a clinician to speak publicly about the various ways in which children and youth are undoubtedly impacted by social economic disparities and systemic racism. She's excited about what can happen when we all collaborate to improve the lives of our children, youth, and communities. Dr. Brown completed her PhD in clinical psychology in 2016 from DePaul University. Dr. Brown then went on to complete her predoctoral internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Miami. Dr. Brown enjoys reading, getting in a hardcore workout, growing her houseplants, and spending time with her family and friends. And now we will turn it over.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the planning committee for inviting me to have this conversation with you, and congratulations on your first year in this series. It's amazing that you are committed to having these very important, as Janan put it, courageous conversations, because they can be difficult, but they are very important. And so tonight I'm going to talk about something that I actually love having conversations about, especially with clinicians. And we're going to talk about, we are at the end of my slide. We're going to talk about how to have conversations about race and racism and social justice with children and adolescents in a therapeutic environment. And I always say that children and adolescents do not come alone. They come with a parent or a caregiver or a teacher or an auntie or an uncle or somebody. And so when we talk about having this conversation with children and adolescents, we're really talking about having this conversation with families, having this conversation with adults, and how can we as clinicians position ourselves to have those conversations? How can we prepare ourselves to have those conversations? And how can we check ourselves before we enter into those conversations? And so I have a couple of goals for tonight, and it would be great if you could come away with one thing that you can apply in your clinical practice, in your research practice, however you apply your psychological knowledge, however you serve your community. It'd be great if you could come away with just one thing that you were able to put into practice immediately as you strive to have these courageous conversations. So I want to start with a moment of mindfulness, and I'm going to ask everyone to just take a minute to acknowledge how your own personal experiences with race or racism or social justice impact your everyday life. And then I want you to also take some time to reflect on how those experiences impact the life of the children and adolescents and families you work with. So what is your experience like? And what is the experience like for the families that you work with? And if you don't work with children or adolescents, you can also think about, what does this look like for your research participants? What does this look like for the adults that you serve? What is your personal experience and what is their personal experience? And as you reflect, I would assume, and maybe my assumption is wrong, that many people are comparing what your experience is like or has been like to the experiences of those that you work with. For many of you, there may be lots of similarities, and for others of you, there may not be any similarities at all. When you reflect on your own personal experiences, there may be certain things that are extremely traumatic or hard for you to reflect on. When you think about the people that you serve and work with, it may be hard to reflect on their experiences or think about their experiences as well. Whatever you're thinking about, because I only gave about 40 seconds or less, that's just the surface level of what we bring into conversations about race and racism and social justice when we have them in a therapeutic room. And so I want you to bring in those experiences and think about the experiences of the families that you work with as we have this conversation. So according to the research, many mental health professionals are not adequately trained to talk about race and racism and social justice in a clinical setting. And so I always take some time to ask you to reflect on what does that mean for you as a clinician if you went to a training program or if you are currently a part of a training program where you aren't having conversations about how to bring these things into a therapeutic room. And then what does that mean for you as a clinician? And then what does that mean for the children and the families and the adolescents and the adults that you then work with? If this is not part of our training, if this is not a conversation that's had. And when I do these seminars in spaces where I can see everyone's faces, I typically ask a moment for everyone to just share. And if you would love to, I would love to see just in the comments, if you can share, was this a part of your training experience? Did you have a class that was more than just like a day of like, hey, today we're going to talk about how to talk about race and racism, but was there a class or a long-term seminar or something tangible that you took away from your training program when it came to how to have these conversations in a therapeutic setting or in your research? And if the answer is yes, how does that impact you as a clinician? How does that then play out in your work? And if the answer is no, how does that impact you as a clinician? And how does that then play out in your work? I always like to start with training because we go through years and years and years of training, and very often it sets the foundation for how we then approach our work. And a lot of times as professionals, I'm pretty sure you're all here to have this conversation and recognize that we sometimes have to retrain ourselves. And when it comes to conversations about race and racism and social justice, there's a lot of retraining and learning and humility, cultural humility that we need to bring into these conversations. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. So why is it important for us to even be having this conversation? Why is it important for us to have conversations about race and racism in a therapeutic setting? I could spend the whole time just talking about the why. But I'm going to go through really quickly on like why it's important for us to have this conversation. So number one, history. We live in a country, we live in a world really where our history is so full of examples where racism, systemic racism have blatantly impacted and changed the trajectory for generations and generations of people. And so by not having conversations, we are ignoring the slavery, we're ignoring Jim Crow, we're ignoring immigration policy and how that impacts people. We need to have these conversations because history tells us that there are people who continue to be impacted by their past. We also know with this history, there is some trauma. And as clinicians, as researchers committed to the well-being of others, a lot of the work that we do is about addressing trauma. And when we think about the history of many people in this country, there's a lot of historical trauma attached to their experiences. And so we have these conversations in a therapeutic setting because we acknowledge that historical trauma. Also, we do work with people who come in with a wide variety of lived experiences. And when we talk about race and racism and social justice in a therapeutic setting, especially those who can really discuss and point to how those things play out in their life, we are acknowledging their lived experience. And I always say there are times when, and we all know there are times when race and racism and or a racially charged event is happening in the media, and it's just like everywhere. It is a disservice to the families that we work with to come into a room and there be no mention or no conversation about what is going on around them. And so we acknowledge the lived experiences of the children, of the adolescents, of the families that we work with when we have these conversations. We also want to provide safe spaces for our clients, for our families to process these experiences, to process their thoughts, to process their feelings. And very often, many children and adolescents identify therapy or identify something that they're reading or something that they have come to as a safe space. And so we want to, as clinicians, as researchers, provide that space. We want to think about the therapeutic alliance and how much bringing in a conversation like this can strengthen the therapeutic alliance. And our conversation about race and racism and social justice is really a recognition of the past. So really a recognition of history, a recognition of the present day impact of racism, and also the need for social justice, and also thinking about the future. So the future of this family in front of you, the future of how we address these things inside and outside of the therapy room. We also want to model that there are appropriate ways to have conversations about race and racism. Very often outside of the therapeutic setting, conversations can be tense, conversations can be hard. A lot of our children and adolescents come to us because they have difficulties navigating difficult conversations. And so we want to model as clinicians in the room how to engage in these conversations in a way that is productive. We also want to provide a space to process. And we also want to think about providing a developmentally appropriate space. So we're really focusing on children and adolescents. So the way that you have a conversation about race and racism and social justice with a 5-year-old or a 12-year-old is very different than how you have it with an adult. And so we want to make sure that we're taking developmental level into this conversation. I had another slide, but I hit it, but I'm going to touch on it very quickly, is that we know that children as young as the age of 6 to 12 months start to recognize racial differences in caregivers and adults around them. And by the age of 4 or 5, kindergarten, pre-K, the research shows that children are really starting to have some bias that is along racial lines. And so it's never too early to have these conversations. And at the same time, we need to take into consideration developmental level. We ask these questions and we have these conversations to provide a space for questions and to show that it is okay, it is important, and it is normal to have these conversations, even if they feel uncomfortable, even if they are hard. It is okay, important, and normal to have these conversations. We know that there's so many things that get in the way. So we just talked about all the whys, and we can continue to talk about the whys, but there are lots of things that get in the way of having this conversation. And I'm going to pause for a little bit, and I want you to think about, in your own clinical practice, in your own research practice, what gets in the way of you having this conversation or having conversations about race and racism and social justice in your work, especially when you're working with children and adolescents, if you do. What gets in the way? And there are 52 people here, and I'm pretty sure there are at least 50 different answers. But we're going to talk about a few of the things that get in the way of these things. And so comfort level, as basic as it sounds, it's sometimes very uncomfortable to have a conversation or bring up something that is or can be very tense to in a therapeutic setting. And so there are there are different levels of comfort. We all have different levels of comfort in having these conversations. And when we aren't comfortable, it prevents us very often from bringing these conversations. Anxiety. So what will this child or adolescent think about me if I bring in this conversation? What is their parent going to say? What does this mean about my profession? Like, what if this gets out to my colleagues that I'm having this conversation? The anxiety around like what it means to have the conversation, and the fear about what will happen if the conversation doesn't go well. Very often in the room, in the therapeutic setting, there's an interplay of racial identities, and very often that gets in the way. So a Black clinician saying like, okay, I can't have this conversation with my white patient or and family because we just don't have the same experience, or this is just not going to go well, or vice versa. This interplay that is sometimes unspoken in the room, getting in the way of the conversation. Not knowing what to say, or the belief that the conversation is not clinically relevant. So this child is coming in because they have disruptive behavior. Why are we having a conversation about racism? And we need to work on following directions. Or we are talking about skills to manage ADHD. Why are we having this conversation? So sometimes that belief that it's not in line with the clinical or treatment plan can get in the way of the conversation. And then questions about whether the topic is developmentally appropriate. And so because there are so many things that get in the way, we really need to ask ourselves, like, what does it take for us to have this conversation? And it takes a lot of things, but there's two that I really want to focus on tonight. And the first one, well, we're not there yet. We're going to talk about two in detail, but it really takes willingness. So you have to be willing to have the conversation. And the fact that you're here tonight listening to a presentation about how to navigate these conversations shows that in some way, shape, or form, you're willing to entertain at least the idea of bringing conversations about race and racism into a therapeutic setting. It takes a lot of self-reflection. And so if we had spent 10 minutes, 20 minutes on our mindfulness activity, I'm pretty sure your mind would have gone and wandered in so many different directions. Having this conversation or having these conversations in a therapeutic space really takes the willingness to reflect on your own experiences, especially if there's something that is happening that is pushing you to have this conversation in a therapeutic setting. It's really important to do some self-reflection, think about what bias you bring into the conversation and how that might impact how you acknowledge or navigate the conversation. It's going to take some preparation, reading, listening, preparing, talking to colleagues. Very often, when I do this for longer, people will say like, well, the first time I had this conversation, I just went in and said like, hey, like, what did you think about so-and-so that we've been seeing? Or what did you think about this, with no preparation? And when we go into our sessions to have these conversations and we are not prepared, very often we can set ourselves up to do a disservice to the families that we work with. And so just like we prepare for conversations about coping strategies, we need to prepare for conversations about race and racism. We need to acknowledge the discomfort that is happening in the room. We need to also acknowledge the privilege and the interplay of the many privileges that we bring into the room just by saying like, hey, I'm going to start this conversation in this therapeutic setting. And if you think about and reflect on your own identities and what privileges you hold, there needs to be an acknowledgement of that in this conversation. And also an acknowledgement of your lived experiences and the lived experiences that your patient has shared with you. And also the acknowledgement that just because you're the clinician and you have lots of background information, it doesn't mean you know the full history of the child or adolescent that you're working with. And so you need to also acknowledge that there are some experiences that your patient, that your client, that this child, this adolescent or family may have shared with you, and there are some that they will never share with you. And there needs to be an acknowledgement of that when you bring these conversations into the room. There also needs to be cultural humility and a commitment to anti-racist behavior, not only anti-racist behavior in your own personal clinical work, but anti-racist behavior in your agency, and anti-racist behavior in the associations that you are a part of. So what exactly is cultural humility? And the NIH defines cultural humility, and I love this definition because it focuses and highlights this lifelong process. So cultural humility is a lifelong process of self-reflection, self-critique, whereby an individual not only learns about another person's culture, but starts to examine their own beliefs and cultural identities. And so it's this commitment to continuing to learn not only about your own cultural beliefs, your own racial identity, your own experiences, it's the commitment to learn about others and to take on the hat of a lifelong student. You will never know enough. You will never know it all. And you do yourself a service, and you do a service to those that you work with when you take on this idea of the forever student. When we practice cultural humility, we are open and committed to evaluating ourselves and what we bring into the room and when we have these conversations. And we're also open to self-critique, like, maybe I shouldn't have said this, or maybe that was a microaggression, or maybe I should have read up on this instead of asking a colleague who has the burden of like always explaining this. We are opening up ourselves to self-evaluation and also critique. We are also recognizing that our learning is never finished. We can never be the expert. We are understanding that flexibility needs to be a part of these conversations about race and racism and social justice. And we are committed to developing partnerships with groups outside of our own where we can advocate for others. And when we think about cultural humility, we really, in this idea of being culturally humble, acknowledge that there are so many different power dynamics and things at play in systems around us. And we push to address those power dynamics, not only in our therapy settings, but we seek to address those on wider and greater scales because we know they trickle down into the room. In addition to cultural humility, we also make a commitment to anti-racist behavior, or want to at least make a commitment to anti-racist behavior when we are having these conversations. And so it is not enough to just say like, I'm not racist, I'm having this conversation. And so that, of course, I'm not racist. Or one of the ones that I've heard a lot is, just because I do this work and I serve this certain population, I am doing the work just by the work that I do. That is not enough. We need to be committed to actively supporting and acting out anti-racist beliefs and ideas through our behaviors, through our policies, through our procedures, through how we interact with the families and children that we serve as soon as they call our agencies, or as soon as they interact with our agency in whatever way that first contact is. Anti-racist behavior requires a lot of things, and I'm just going to highlight the last two when we talk about anti-racist behavior in healthcare and specifically in mental health care. Anti-racist behavior really requires that we confront any racist ideas that we may hold. And there are so many different ways that we can do that, so many different ways that we can hold those in our agencies accountable for that, but we really need to do that if we are committed to anti-racist behavior. And we also need to think about how we can become a champion of ideas and policies and procedures that are not racist. So it's not just enough to say like, we are an open, caring agency where we care for everyone, but you really need to examine, is our intake procedure racist? Are there microaggressions in the questions that we ask people when we're asking them to fill out forms? That is part of anti-racist behavior. It's deep, hard work. And if we are having these conversations about race and racism and social justice in these settings, we need to be committed to doing that hard work. Where does this conversation start? So where do we even start the conversation about racism and race and social justice in a therapeutic setting? Like, how do we bring that up? When do we start the conversation? Do we wait until we know a family's a little bit more? Are we waiting until they bring it up? All the questions that kind of swarm around when we think about, okay, how are we going to have this conversation? And I truly believe that we start to have these conversations at intake, and I'm actually going to change the slide. I think we start to have this conversation as soon as a child, adolescent, or family or parent has first contact with our agency. And so that first contact looks different. It could be social media. It could be a flyer that they see in their pediatrician's office. It could be someone calling them to just like introduce because the agency's new in the area. We start this conversation as soon as we have contact with the family, with the child, with the adolescent. When we start this conversation as soon as possible, or at the first point of entry, we are sending a very strong message. And the message that we're sending is, number one, we're willing to have this conversation. And number two, that we can continue the discussion if needed. And so we start this conversation and then we continue it throughout treatment. And so we want to think about it in treatment planning. We want to talk about it and we want to talk about how race and racism and culture and social justice, how that plays out in the skills that your child or the adolescent are learning throughout treatment, and how the families are going to use them in their home. We are going to incorporate the conversation when we talk about the lived experiences of the child or adolescent. We are going to have the conversation when there is a racially charged event in the news. I remember right after the murder of George Floyd, I work in New York City, and a lot of the children that I work with could hear the protests from their window. So they could literally hear it. If they looked out the window, they could see protests. And there were so many questions about like, what is that? What does Black Lives Matter mean? Like, why are they shouting these things? And yes, they were there to talk about, okay, how can you make sure you get your homework in, and how can you stop disturbing the class, or let's focus on some coping strategies for anxiety. But part of this commitment to having these conversations throughout is saying, okay, you're bringing this up after a really big event and something that you're continuing to see. And I'm going to acknowledge your lived experience by having this conversation as long as we need to. Or whenever your patient brings up the topic, or whenever possible, having this conversation. Or exposing or letting your client know that, hey, we can have this conversation if we need to. What happens in the individual therapy room with your adolescent and child patients is really important, but what happens at your agency is extremely important as well. And so we want clinicians to feel supported by the places and spaces that they serve from. And so there has to be a culture in your agency and a practice in your agency where you are discussing race and racism and your commitment to social justice. And so ask yourself right now, is there a culture in the agency organization that you work with where we support and talk about racism and race and our commitment to social justice? And on top of this kind of culture about talking about it, I want you to take it a step further. Is there a practice of actually implementing all the things that you talk about? because we can talk and talk and talk and engage in all this like theoretical, like great conversation. And if it never leaves the staff meeting, if it never leaves the in service, if it never leaves the room, it really means nothing. And so is there a practice that does your agency support this conversation, and do you see it in practice? This culture has to be created. It's not a culture that is just like, all right, this is how we do it, unless you work for like some beautiful agency that I would love to come to. It has to be created. So there needs to be continuous discussions about race and racism in meetings, in case presentations, in training, in workshops, in continuing education things. It needs to be kind of like, hey, when we talk about anything, we are asking ourselves, how does racism play into this? What kind of social justice action can we take, knowing that these families are impacted in this way because of these things? Constant conversations. We need to hold each other accountable. So how can we hold our colleagues accountable for their racist thoughts, for their racist ideas and their behaviors? And how can we create workspaces and work environments where policies and procedures are reflective of anti-racist behavior? And so I kind of pop out a little bit to talk a little bit about the agency before I go back into what happens in the individual room. Because the more and more, and I think we all experience this, is what happens in the room with the children and adolescents and families that we work with very often is informed by the policies and the procedures and the culture of the space and place where we work. And so in order for us to be culturally humble, in order for us to practice anti-racist behavior, in order for us to be willing, there has to be a culture in our agency that supports this. And there are some considerations that we need to take into account when we have these conversations about race and racism and social justice in a therapeutic setting with adolescents and children. Like I said earlier, we want to make sure that we are being mindful of developmental level. And so this conversation with a 5-year-old looks very different than with a 12-year-old. Looks very different with a teenager, a 17-year-old. The conversation is going to look very different, and we want to make sure that we are mindful of developmental level. And as clinicians, we know that developmental level is not just age. 2 5-year-olds could be in completely different developmental levels in terms of their experiences, in terms of their cognitive functionings. There's so many things that play into that. And when we have this conversation, we want to take that into consideration. We want to create opportunities for a safe space for discussion. And very often when I bring up this conversation or when it comes up, there's sometimes when the children and adolescents that I work with send me very clear messages that they're not ready to have this conversation, or they're like, oh, Tasha, we're not going there with you, or for whatever reason, they just are not wanting to have the conversation. And creating a safe space for discussion also means respecting the fact that, hey, I don't want to go here today. And so very often I'll say, okay, you don't want to talk about it, but just know that this is something that if you need to, we can talk about it in this setting. We want to listen, and we want to use our handy dandy reflective statements. We are not in the lead of this conversation. If we go down a little bit more, it talks about following the child and adolescent's lead. We are introducing, if needed, the conversation, but we really want to follow the lead of the child or adolescent that we work with. Their questions, their body language, their silence, their volume, all of that is going to give us a lot of information about where they want to take this conversation, what's on their mind, what they need to know, what they need to process. And so we need to listen, use reflective statements, take the back seat, and let them lead the conversation. This is really hard, especially if we're like following like a manualized treatment where we're in lead, like, hey, today we're coming in, we're talking about negative thoughts, we're talking about how to challenge those. We're kind of sometimes in the lead of these conversations of the session, depending on what type of treatment we practice. And so for some of us, that may mean restructuring how we approach therapy in general. Remember, part of cultural humility is really thinking about and asking ourselves, okay, am I doing this right? Is this appropriate? We want to model authenticity. And so these conversations can get really difficult. And they're not just difficult for the children and adolescents that we have the conversations with, they're difficult for us as well. And so we want to humanize the conversation by being authentic in how we speak, being authentic in how we're feeling about these things, so that we're modeling to the children and adolescents that we work with that it's okay to bring your true feelings and experiences into this. There is so much power in play, in art, in visuals, in creativity. And so pull out your crayons, your markers, your clay, get on the floor, pull out your dolls, and let children really explore their thoughts and process their feelings around things through these really like hands-on, tangible activities. And even if it means completely like shifting the room that you have therapy in or the virtual space that you have therapy in, it means that you want to just create that space as much as possible. Consult with your colleagues. And so, because these conversations can be difficult, because we always don't know everything, because we're taking this stance of cultural humility, we want to make sure that we are consulting with people who may be able to lend information that will then help us serve our families. And then lastly, one other consideration is to take into account that sometimes, or maybe all the time, we need to take care of ourselves while we have these conversations. And taking care of yourself can look like so many different things. It could look like engaging in your own therapy where you're processing some of these things. It could look like reading. It could look like setting boundaries about how and when you have these conversations in a workspace. Whatever that looks like for you to take care of yourself so that when you need to show up for the children and adolescents that you work with, you're able to do that. And we all know as clinicians, that can look different based on the day, based on what's going on. And that is part of our cultural humility in terms of like navigating these conversations. What is our role as a clinician? I definitely want to leave some time for questions and conversation because I see that there's some questions popping up. But I also, in thinking about considerations when talking to children and adolescents, we also need to think about our role as the clinician. So one thing is we need to acknowledge that most of the evidence-based treatments that we live by were not created or researched on Black, Indigenous, people of color, children, or their families. And yes, the research is catching up in many ways, but I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that a lot of what we do, the foundation was not set with these families in mind. And what does that mean for what it is we ask them to do? What does that mean for what it is we teach them? And part of our role as a clinician is to, number one, acknowledge that, and then taking it a step further, thinking about, okay, I acknowledge that this is the case. How do I then tailor my approach for this family that I am working with? We want to implement our treatment with fidelity. So we want to make sure that we are doing what we know works, and also at the same time being flexible. And sometimes fidelity and flexibility are like kind of tug back and forth with each other, but we want to be flexible in our approach. Sometimes we have to throw the plan away, and not just for a moment in the session. Sometimes we have to throw the plan away for a few sessions because it may take more than 2 sessions to process racism, or to process something that happened at school that really triggered a child to feel negatively about themselves because they experienced a microaggression. And it takes some flexibility in our approach. Our goal is to also constantly ask for feedback. Are you comfortable having this conversation? What was this conversation like for you? Asking, when I work with really young children, I also incorporate their parents and thinking about the feedback that they can provide. We also want to take into consideration what we know about the families that we're working with. And like I said earlier, part of that is also taking into consideration that we may not know everything about this family. We may not know everything, and we may never know that. And so we are respectful of the things that they choose to share with us. We also need to take into consideration, as our role as clinicians, that there are many cultural and ethical values and suggestions that are made in a lot of the treatments that we do, and how can we make sure that our families are receptive to those things, and we're not expressing any racism or racial ideology when we assign or talk about these things. And then our role as a clinician is really to use the child, really to use the adolescent and the family as a guide for these conversations. All right. So I am going to stop right now. I think we could have this conversation for hours and hours, but we have about 10 more minutes, I think. I'm not even sure. And I want to see if there were any questions or comments or anything that you think we should touch on a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I will take the liberty here to read a question. There's actually 2 questions in the Q&A. So to all of our participants who are attending this evening, if you would like to put a question in the Q&A section, we have access to that, and I'll read the first one aloud. In regards to developing an anti-racist culture in an agency, is there any advice you have if many of the, I'm assuming, staff members are actively involved in practicing, but there are a few that are absent from meetings and conversations? The silence is notable.
Yeah, I think that is that's a conflict when these conversations are happening. People are not participating, and I always say, call it out and think about, your agency, the people that you work with, what's going to be, what people are going to be receptive to, but thinking about ways to call that out. Or to share the information in other ways. So it may mean that after every single meeting where these conversations are being had, maybe an email goes out, maybe a newsletter goes out, maybe it's revisited in another meeting that had nothing to do with the main meeting. Like, hey, in our staff meeting on Wednesday, we talked about how we can really pull out some microaggressions. I know we're here to talk about policies and procedures for the intake desk, but just wanted to remind everyone that that's what we talked about. Here were a few of our points. Let's get on, so that everyone has different points in time where they can access the information. And then silence is noticeable, and silence is strong and means a lot when it comes to conversations not being had about racism and social justice. And so really calling that out. If we are an agency that is committed to X, Y, and Z, whatever your agency's mission statement is. How can we not all be included in conversations like this? Or what will it take for us all to be in conversations? Sometimes there are, and I'm speaking from like personal experiences, there are times when the way conversations about social justice and how we're going to approach that, or conversations about racism in a work setting are had, that are difficult for me to engage in. And so it's not that I want to be silent, or it's not that I don't have anything to say, but it's the way that the conversation is being had is just not in line with my thinking or what energy I have to bring to the space. And so maybe asking like, hey, we notice that there's some people who never participate. Are there other ways, other spaces, other things that we can do to have these conversations so that everyone can be a part? And then this part of the answer that I don't even like is acceptance that unfortunately, not everyone is going to be involved in these conversations. And that's the frustrating part, especially when we want to serve in the best way that we can. Not everyone's going to be involved in those conversations. And a lot of times, a lot of our energy can go into, well, so-and-so is not involved in this conversation, then what does that mean? And sometimes after many efforts, we have to think about how can we redirect our energy so that we can make additional change rather than thinking about how to get people who don't want to be involved. Because it's a process. It takes some people multiple points of entry to commit to cultural humility or to commit to anti-racist behavior, to even understand what those things are. And so being respectful of everyone's journey and still making it accessible to all.
Thank you. We have another question in the Q&A section. Are there any specific examples of how to bring up racism, or I'm sorry, of bringing up how racism exists when white parents have adopted a child of color and are thinking there is no need to talk about race?
That is such an amazing question, because this comes up so much in my clinical work. And it's hard. It's a hard thing to navigate. And I kind of go in so many different directions with this. Number one, and I can share this with the committee that they can like blast out to the group after, is that I have a list of resources and books and videos and things that I just say like, hey, here are some books that you can introduce to yourself first to see how your comfort level in them, and then introduce to your child. Here are some videos that you can watch. Here are some groups that you can be a part of to talk with other parents who have similar experiences about how they even, not about how they had these conversations, but how they even got to the point where they felt it was necessary to have these conversations. And a lot of times I have to pull back a lot and just talk about identity. And I spend a lot of time with these parents saying, okay, how do you identify? Let's talk about all the different ways that you identify as a person living in this world, in this space. Okay, now let's kind of think about the ways in which your child identifies or has to identify or may have to identify in the future. And then let's kind of compare and contrast. And a lot of times there are, well, most of the time, all the time, there's going to be some things that are not similar, and really using that as an entry point. You identify as a white man living in New York City. Your child is eventually going to identify as a Black person living in this space. What does that mean? What does that look like? And very often they'll say like, I don't know. Exactly. You don't know, which is why it's important for us to start to have these conversations about all the potential things that can come up in that identity. And it's a hard conversation. It's a constant conversation. And a lot of times what I tell parents, especially parents of young children, is that you not bringing this up now puts you in a space where your child will most likely eventually bring it up. and you're playing a lot of defense, like trying to catch up, trying to kind of figure something out to tell them. If you take this developmental approach and have a constant and consistent conversation, you are going to, number one, strengthen the parent-child relationship. You're going to make it easier for your child to come to you about these things. You're going to give them the coping strategies and give them access to the tools that they need to deal with racism when it does come up. It's hard. There is a lot of resistance, and I think really taking into consideration the family you're working with and what entry point they need for the conversation. And what I found is that it very often needs multiple entry points. Yeah.
I just want to acknowledge someone asked about resources in the Q&A. So thank you for touching upon that briefly. We do have everyone's email address who attended tonight, so we can share those resources as well as giving instructions about how to share the recording to this. There's two questions that I want to just put in the space. First, you mentioned books. Are there children books about being biracial in America? And second, can you please offer some suggestions regarding language that could be used by white and Black clinicians during first sessions that would introduce the topic of race and identity?
Great, I love both of those questions. Off the top of, so I'll start with the second question on some language that can be used in first sessions. Can you tell me a little bit about your family? I love the explicit question of how does your family identify racially? Tell me a little bit about your community. There is a question in my intake questionnaire that explicitly says, have you ever experienced, and do you have any experiences with racism? Have you been exposed to any racial trauma? Like really explicitly asking those questions. When you have when you're dealing with younger children, there are different ways to ask those questions. Do you know what racism is? For even younger children, what are some of the ways that you are similar to your classmates? What are some of the ways that you are different from your classmates? There are ways to start to have this conversation at different pinpoints, and the language is really important. And sometimes I think we all do this, is that we overthink and get caught up in the language. And sometimes a straightforward, like, hey, I'm just gonna ask this question. It may feel really uncomfortable, but families will be like, whew, like, I really appreciate that they brought this up in the room. Even though I could tell it was like a little hard for them, explicitly asking some of those questions can be helpful as well. And then the second question about resources around children's books around being biracial, part of the resources that I have that I'm going to send out has like a whole list of books that you can use. And it really does help to normalize the questions. Sometimes I say, like, I ask these questions to everyone because it's part of me wanting to get to know you and your family and to serve you a little bit more. And so I'm going to ask you some questions that you may have never heard in your doctor's office, or you may not have heard with your previous clinician, but I'm asking them because I feel like it's a really important part of the relationship that we're starting right now. Normalizing those questions.
Thank you. And we will end with this last question before we wrap up our time this evening. You mentioned that we should be considering the role of racism in everything, and I agree, especially since racism is so ubiquitous. With this approach, have you encountered pushback from colleagues highlighting other important issues, such as it's always about race, what about X, Y, and Z? How have you responded to this resistance? And if not, how would you?
Yeah, as soon as I heard this question, I vividly remember, this was a few years ago, we were in I can't even remember, it was a case conference, and the presenter was talking about racism that her patient experienced. And someone raised their hand and completely said, like, I know it's really important for us to have this conversation, but what about X, Y, and Z that had nothing to do? And in those moments, I think number one, so many things happen internally when that happens in your head. So it's like, okay, why did this person just do that? Like, well, what's the audacity? Like, does this mean that I'm going too much? Your negative thoughts or your thoughts can start to really spiral. It's staying the course of like redirection. Thank you for that really important question. That's something we can talk about later, but right now I feel like it's really important that we talk about how this patient is being impacted by the microaggressions they're experiencing at school that is leading to their anxiety. Bringing it back. Thank you for that question. Or right now we can't really address that. Always bringing it back to the conversation, and bringing it back sends the message that this conversation is important. Yes, we know that psychosocial history, this is part of it, but we know those other things are important. And I'm having this conversation right now because this is equally important. And if we don't address this, we can't adequately address all the other things happening in this family's life.
Awesome, thank you. I'm just going to share a few quick links in the chat. The first is a link to our post-seminar survey. It's only a few questions. You can answer it really quickly. That would be great. I'm also going to just say thank you to our speaker. Thank you, Dr. Tasha Brown, for sharing your brilliance with us this evening. Thank you so much for making time and creating a small community amongst us and our participants. We will look forward to the resources that you'll share, and then we will also blast them to the participants so they have access to those. Also, again, thank you to our donors. We really appreciate your support. Without your donations, our seminar series would not be possible. So thank you. And if you are looking to donate, I am also putting that link in the chat. Sorry, I'm managing a lot of tech needs here. But lastly, I'm speaking really fast, but I want to make sure that we just have the chance to announce that our next seminar series will be March 24th at 7 to 8, sorry. And we will have Dr. Madeline Sternerson coming from Yale School of Medicine to talk about social justice, specifically for those who are involved in the sex trade. I am going to multitask and make sure that link is also being shared in the chat. So hopefully that PDF shows up. If not, it'll be on the CPA website. Again, thank you all. Have a great evening, and we'll see you next month. Bye.
Everybody. Thanks, Dr. Brown.
Thanks for having me.
This was wonderful.
Wonderful. And we really need that, in our teaching, treatment sessions. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I wish these are things I learned when I was in grad school. I'm not a clinician, but still the fact that I earned a PhD and they threw me into courses without ever teaching us how to navigate topics such as race in psych classes is really scary. And I had to kind of train myself by going through webinars and whatnot. But I think there are a lot of systemic issues just in education in general, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah,
so you're doing amazing work.
Thank you. Well,
and it didn't matter that it was focused on kids. This is relevant to every, I think everything